Hey everybody, so this is my next YouTube video, and we're going to be talking about AJAX today because it was a very fast-moving topic that we covered in class, and I know that there was a fair amount of confusion, at least during class, so I felt it would be good to go over the lab that we all did together and just briefly touch on what AJAX is, what it's used for, so that we understand the process that we all went through together. So I'm going to start out by saying that sometimes when we are maintaining a web page, we want to be able to communicate with a remote server in real time. AJAX, from our README that we had in our lab, allows us to communicate with that server behind the scenes in real time and make modifications on our web page without resetting the web page, without refreshing it, without being sent to a new page. And that way we're going to be able to maintain data between function calls and that sort of thing a lot more easily. Before I begin, I'm just going to briefly refresh everybody on what the server is that we're communicating with. It's just this really simple JSON string that's being stored in this Heroku app. Back here, it has a book with an ID and a title and an author. And what we're going to be doing with our application is we're going to be having an HTML web form over here, in particular this box, the second one, which we can put a book ID into, and it will remove this book from the list. It will tell us that the book has been deleted. And when we go back to our JSON and we search up We the Living by Ayn Rand, we are no longer going to see the book in this JSON string. As you can see, phrase not found. So how do we do that? Well, we start with a basic HTML file in here called index.html. And what we're going to be doing here is essentially using this web form to make a call to the server, kind of like what we learned about and talked about with curl, but I'm not going to focus on that right now. We are going to make this call with a form near the bottom called delete book form with a submit button where we put in the ID and we delete the book. So now we're going to go step by step through this application and see what's happening behind the scenes when you hit this submit button. The first key file that we worked on was this file app.js. What this function essentially does, or what this page essentially does, is it has a function here, the document.ready function, and this document.ready function essentially fires off as soon as you load the page. This is the function that it runs. On the inside, it's an inner callback function. As you can see, it doesn't take any parameters, it just runs. And what it does is it puts event listeners using jQuery onto our get books button, onto our submit button for the show book form, and onto our submit button for the delete book form, which we have in this line right here. So now that I've talked about the event listener, I'm going to talk about how we're handling the event. This is the function that I've got which handles deleting a book by its ID. And it's a function that takes in an event, which we pass to it from app.js. And first, because all web forms, when you submit them, would refresh the page, we have to prevent the default action. And this console.log, if you were to stop the code here, it would just tell you it's in the form listener. Now, we have a bit of code that General Assembly gave us that can help us extract this field, the book ID, which right here you see name equals book ID, type equals text, that's this input field right here. And the code that General Assembly gave us in the events file essentially just gets out that book ID that we put in. And then we do our server call, API.deleteBook book ID. That's going to call a function here in this API that uses an AJAX on the server. I'll get to that shortly. We then receive from the server either a 200 status code indicating that deleting the book was a success, or we'll receive from the server a 400 status code or some other status code indicating that it was a failure. Let's look at that server call. This server call is where we start to see AJAX being used. AJAX is what we're using to essentially do the curl command that we had in here, except not from the command line, but from our JavaScript. We are sending to the server a command delete to this URL, which is the JSON string plus the book ID, which we can see, for example, if we were to look at this book ID right here, it would bring up the book that I just grabbed, A House for Mr. Biswas, and this is the JSON item, or the part of our JSON that we will be deleting with this AJAX command function. It's our API call. With the success, we are then going to go into our user interface file, which modifies the interface that we're using in order to handle what happens when we have a success and what happens with a failure. So here we have our delete book success. It's fairly straightforward. We're essentially just adding an HTML element to our HTML document, just the div ID deleted book over here. We say book has been deleted. Or if we fail to delete the book, we return an error with the error status that gets generated with our failed call. Now, we never actually passed in response explicitly in here. We're just passing in the function delete book success, but we're doing that because our functions here essentially automatically pass in our response as the input for our delete book success function. We don't have to worry about it. That's what happens in that line of code. And this function over here catches that response, or receives the response because we need to catch errors, and does whatever we wanted to our HTML document. Of course, as we discussed in class, we could make a big list of book titles and add them over here and for each book, and then make that our inner HTML. If we were doing something like that with a get, we could do any of a number of things, but just remember, you always have to catch the error. What we did in the bottom with module.exports is fairly straightforward. We just added functions that we used in other files. So because our events.js function or file used these two functions, delete book success, we imported over here the UI of the API. We also imported the General Assembly code that gets our stuff from the form. So I'll show again the code in action with the ID right here, book ID, submit, book has been deleted. We'll submit again. It's gone. You can't find it. I hope that helps at least review some of the stuff we did today. I know I didn't do a full code walkthrough, but at least it recovers some of the concepts for your study in the future, so you can go back and actually see what's going on. Thanks for watching.